You know something's shifting in American politics when even CNN's Van Jones, one of the most loyal voices of the left, starts sounding nervous. He just admitted that Zohran Mamdani's fiery victory speech didn't sound like leadership. It sounded like something darker. And while Democrats scrambled to explain that tone, the Supreme Court just handed Trump his 24th legal win, signaling that the balance of power is shifting right under their feet. What's happening right now isn't just politics, it's a reckoning. Because one side is preaching revolution, and the other side is quietly winning in courtrooms, states, and hearts across America. Let's unpack this moment, because it might just define the next decade. Picture this. You're watching election night coverage on CNN, and the results from New York City come in. The progressive candidate wins decisively. The crowd erupts. Confetti falls. The cameras cut to the victory speech. You'd expect celebration, maybe some gracious words about unity and moving forward together. But that's not what happened. What came through that microphone was something else entirely. The tone was sharp, almost angry. The message wasn't about bringing people together. It was about division, about winners and losers, about taking from some to give to others. And sitting in the CNN studio, Van Jones, a man who's defended progressive causes for decades, looked genuinely uncomfortable. He said something remarkable. He said the warm, open, embracing guy voters saw on the campaign trail wasn't on that stage. Instead, there was some other voice speaking, someone almost yelling into the microphone. Jones worried aloud whether Mamdani would be more of a class warrior than a unifier. Think about that for a moment. One of the left's most prominent voices expressing concern about a progressive victory. What does that tell you? It tells you the mask slipped. During the campaign, Mamdani was all smiles, soft lighting, and friendly videos on social media. He talked about helping working people, making life more affordable, being there for ordinary New Yorkers. It sounded reasonable, even appealing. But the moment victory was secured, the tone changed. The rhetoric shifted. Suddenly it wasn't about helping everyone. It was about identifying enemies and punishing them. Now, if you've lived through a few decades of history like many of us have, this pattern might sound familiar. It echoes other moments, other movements, other promises that started with idealism and ended with control. I'm thinking of stories from people who lived through political upheavals, not here in America, but in places that tried to remake society from the ground up based on grand theories about equality and fairness. There's a man who used to teach classical guitar, came here from Cuba decades ago. He remembers being a child when Castro's revolution swept through. At first, the soldiers came into his village and handed out candy to the children. Everyone was told they were being liberated from oppression. Finally, they were free. The kids loved it. The promises sounded wonderful. Everyone would have what they needed. Nobody would be left behind. But then, just days later, everything changed. The tone shifted. The friendly faces became stern. Neighbors started disappearing in the middle of the night. Businesses were seized. Families who'd built something over generations watched it taken away because it was deemed unfair that they had more than others. The candy turned to ashes pretty quickly. That's the thing about these movements. They start with promises of paradise, with talk of fairness and justice and equality. But they always require someone to be the villain. Someone has to be blamed for why paradise hasn't arrived yet. And that someone is usually whoever has worked hard, saved money, built a business, or simply wants to live their life without the government controlling every aspect of it. So when Van Jones heard that tone in Mamdani's voice, maybe somewhere deep down he recognized the pattern. Maybe he realized this wasn't just progressive politics. This was something more extreme, something that might not stop at reasonable reforms. And the proof is already showing up in the real world, not just in speeches. Within hours of Mamdani's election, people started voting with their feet. Not just any people, but the people who make a city run. Business owners, professionals, job creators. There's an Asian restaurant chain, pretty successful, operates in several cities. They announced they're moving their headquarters from New York to Tampa, Florida, just like that. Because they looked at what was coming and decided they didn't want any part of it. And they're not alone. Over the past couple of years, More than 100,000 New Yorkers have already relocated to Florida. Think about that number. That's like an entire mid-sized city picking up and leaving. And they took their money with them, somewhere between $10 and $15 billion in income that used to be taxed by New York, now flowing into Florida's economy instead. Mamdani has proposed raising taxes even further on high earners, adding another percentage point or two on top of what's already one of the highest tax burdens in the nation. That would push the total tax rate past 50%. Imagine working hard all year and knowing that more than half of what you earn goes to the government. At some point, people just say enough and leave. And that's exactly what's happening. It's not just businesses and wealthy individuals either. Within hours of the election results, New York's fire commissioner resigned. No detailed explanation, just a quiet resignation. But the timing speaks volumes. When public officials start stepping down the moment a new administration is about to take over, it tells you they don't want to be associated with what's coming. They see the writing on the wall. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. While all this chaos is brewing in New York, something very different is happening in Washington. The Supreme Court just ruled on a case involving passport designations. The question was whether people could list their gender as something other than male or female on official government documents. The Trump administration said no, passports should reflect their biological sex. Lower courts blocked that policy. But the Supreme Court, in a 6-3 decision, said the administration was within its rights to enforce that standard. This is the 24th time the Supreme Court has ruled in favor of Trump administration policies. 24th. Let that sink in for a moment. While the headlines scream about controversy and chaos, the highest court in the land keeps saying, actually, these policies are legal, they're constitutional, they're within the proper boundaries of executive authority. What we're witnessing is a quiet but profound shift in the judicial branch. For years, courts have been used as tools to advance progressive social policies that couldn't get through the legislature. Judges would discover new rights in the Constitution that nobody had noticed for 2 centuries. They'd strike down laws based on evolving standards and international norms. But now there's a different approach taking hold. It's called reading what the Constitution actually says and applying it. This isn't about politics in the usual sense. It's about the proper role of government and the limits of power. The Supreme Court is essentially saying that there are boundaries, that not everything is up for grabs, that some things are grounded in reality and tradition and the written law, and more often than not, those boundaries are protecting policies that most Americans consider common sense. The 3 justices who dissented, all appointed by Democratic presidents, wrote that the government was causing immediate harm by enforcing this policy. But here's the thing, when you step back and think about it, is there really harm in having official documents reflect biological reality? Or is the harm in pretending that reality doesn't matter and that feelings should override facts in legal documents? Most people, if you ask them privately, know the answer to that question. They're just afraid to say it out loud because they've been told it's not acceptable to speak common sense anymore. But the court isn't afraid. And that's significant, because it means there's at least one institution that's willing to stand firm and say some things aren't negotiable, some standards aren't changeable based on whatever the current cultural fashion happens to be. This pattern of legal victories extends beyond just this one case. Over the past few years, the Supreme Court has been systematically reversing decades of liberal judicial activism. Cases about religious liberty, free speech, gun rights, executive authority, they're all trending in the same direction. Not because the court is partisan, but because the Constitution, when read as written, supports these outcomes. So you have this stark contrast developing. In New York, a newly elected official comes in with revolutionary rhetoric, promising to overturn systems and redistribute wealth and punish the successful. And immediately, the productive people start leaving, the money flows out, officials resign, and the whole thing begins to crumble before it even starts. Meanwhile, in Washington, the court is quietly building a foundation of precedents that restore traditional American principles. Order versus chaos, reality versus fantasy, results versus rhetoric. And nowhere is that contrast more obvious than in what's happening in Congress right now. Federal workers aren't getting paid. Essential services are strained. And in the middle of all this, Senator John Kennedy from Louisiana introduced a bill. Simple idea. Members of Congress shouldn't get paid during a shutdown. If federal workers aren't being paid, why should the senators and representatives who failed to pass a budget? Makes sense, right? You'd think it would pass unanimously, but it didn't pass at all. It was blocked. And not by a Democrat, but by Rand Paul, a Republican senator from Kentucky who styles himself as a fiscal conservative. His reasoning? Well, members of Congress have a contract, and you can't just stop paying people who have a contract and are doing their work. Except here's the problem with that argument. The House of Representatives isn't even in session. They're not working. They're home in their districts while the government is shut down and millions of Americans are struggling. So Kennedy came back with a compromise. Okay, fine, don't cancel their pay permanently. Just withhold it during the shutdown and pay them back later once the government reopens. That way nobody loses money, but there's at least some shared sacrifice, some symbolic gesture that Congress understands the pain they're causing. Blocked again. And this tells you something important about the political class, regardless of party. There's a fundamental disconnect between them and us. They live in a different world, where their paychecks are guaranteed, where they have special health care plans and pension systems that ordinary Americans can only dream about, where the rules that apply to everyone else somehow don't apply to them. And while they're protecting their own salaries, there are millions of Americans who depend on food assistance programs, people who are genuinely struggling, and a federal judge just ordered the administration to immediately pay out full benefits for those programs despite the shutdown. The Trump administration appealed that ruling, not because they want people to go hungry, but because there's literally no money appropriated to pay for it. You can't just order the government to spend money that hasn't been allocated by Congress. That's not how the system works. But the judge said people are going hungry right now, today, and that's unacceptable. And he's right. It is unacceptable. But here's the hard truth that nobody wants to say out loud. You can't solve that problem by judicial fiat. If there's no money in the account, ordering someone to write a check doesn't create the money. All it does is highlight the dysfunction, the fact that the people we elected to manage these things have failed to do their basic job. And this is where the rubber meets the road for ordinary Americans. Because they look at this mess and they think, somebody needs to fix this. Somebody needs to stand up and make sense of it all and actually deliver results instead of excuses. And that's where figures like Mamdani gain traction, even though many believe his solutions would make everything worse. He offers simplicity. He says the problem is rich people, corporations, the system itself. Burn it down and start over. It's emotionally satisfying. It's easy to understand. The only problem is it doesn't work. It's never worked. Anywhere. Ever. But that message still resonates with a certain segment of the population, particularly younger voters, who haven't lived through the consequences of these ideas. There were reporters out on the streets of New York after the election, interviewing people who voted for Mamdani, asking them why. And the answers were genuinely revealing, not because of what people knew, but because of what they didn't know. One young woman said she was happy he won, but when asked why, she literally said, "I don't know. I just am." Another said she liked the TikTok videos of him at parties and clubs, that he seemed like one of the people. Someone else mentioned hoping he could get things done but couldn't name a single specific policy when asked. Another supporter said something about making education more equitable and reliable, but when pressed on how that would actually work, the response was, "I don't know." This is what we're dealing with. Not informed disagreement about policy approaches, but emotional attachment to a personality, a vibe, a feeling that someone cares. And to be fair, that's not entirely the voters' fault. They've been failed by an education system that doesn't teach critical thinking or basic economics. They've been failed by a media environment that rewards emotional manipulation over factual analysis. They've been failed by a political establishment that's made everything so complicated and corrupt that burning it all down starts to sound reasonable. But here's what experience teaches you. And this is something those of us who've been around a while understand instinctively. Feelings don't pay bills. Vibes don't create jobs. Good intentions don't fill grocery carts. At some point, reality asserts itself. And when these young voters discover that the rent freeze Mamdani promised can't actually happen because the state constitution prevents it, when they realize that free transit means worse service because there's no money for maintenance, when they watch their favorite local businesses close because the owners couldn't afford the new tax burden, the emotional appeal will fade pretty quickly. There's a generational divide here that can't be ignored. If you look at the voting data, Mamdani won overwhelmingly among voters under 45, but among voters over 45, particularly those over 60, the race was much closer. And in some areas, he actually lost. Why? Because older voters have pattern recognition. They've seen this movie before. They remember the promises made by other charismatic figures who are going to fundamentally transform things, and they remember how it actually turned out. They remember the 1,970 seconds in New York, when similar policies led to near bankruptcy, massive population loss, skyrocketing crime, and urban decay. They remember when the subways were covered in graffiti and you couldn't walk through Central Park at night. They remember when businesses fled and entire neighborhoods became war zones. And they remember what it took to fix all that. Decades of hard work, pro-growth policies, supporting police, encouraging business investment, and rejecting the siren song of redistribution. But memories fade. New generations come along who didn't live through those experiences, and the cycle threatens to repeat itself. Unless something interrupts the pattern, unless there's an alternative that's equally compelling but actually grounded in reality. And that's where Trump's approach becomes relevant, not because he's perfect or beyond criticism, but because he represents a different kind of populism. Mamdani is offering emotional populism, the kind that runs on resentment and promises that sound too good to be true because they are too good to be true. Trump, for all his flaws and bombast, offers pragmatic populism. He identifies the same problems, the same frustrations, the same sense that ordinary people are getting screwed by a rigged system. But his solutions are fundamentally different. Instead of punishing success, he wants to create conditions where success is more accessible. Instead of redistributing a shrinking pie, he wants to grow the pie. Instead of attacking businesses, he wants to remove the obstacles that make it hard for businesses to thrive and create jobs. Instead of dividing people into oppressors and victims, he appeals to a shared national identity and common interest. And here's the crucial difference. His approach produces measurable results. You can look at economic data before and after certain policies. You can count the number of jobs created, the wage growth, the business formation rates, the investment flows. You can see the Supreme Court victories stacking up. You can point to concrete achievements, not just soaring rhetoric. That's the advantage of being grounded in reality. Reality doesn't care about your feelings. It doesn't care about your good intentions. It just is. And policies that align with reality tend to work, while policies that ignore reality tend to fail, no matter how emotionally appealing they are. This is something that gets lost in our current political discourse. We've become so focused on how things make us feel that we've stopped asking whether they actually work. Someone proposes a policy that sounds compassionate, and if you question whether it will achieve its stated goals, you're accused of being heartless. But real compassion isn't about what makes you feel good. It's about what actually helps people. If you really care about struggling families, you should want policies that create jobs and reduce the cost of living, even if those policies don't sound as emotionally satisfying as promising free everything. If you really care about the vulnerable, you should want a stable society with functioning institutions, even if that requires saying no to demands that would bankrupt those institutions. If you really care about the next generation, you should want to leave them a country that works, not a country buried in debt and divided against itself. And increasingly, Americans are figuring this out. Not all of them, not overnight, but gradually, through painful experience. They're noticing that the places with the most generous promises tend to have the worst outcomes. They're noticing that people and businesses are fleeing blue states for red states in record numbers. They're noticing that despite all the revolutionary rhetoric, life isn't getting better in the places where that rhetoric is turned into policy. That's why there were voters in New York who cast ballots for Trump and then turned around and voted for Mamdani just months later. They're not ideological. They're desperate. They want someone to shake things up to fight for them, to take on the powerful interests that have made life unaffordable. They don't care if that person is a conservative billionaire or a socialist organizer, as long as they believe that person is on their side against an establishment that clearly isn't. This is the volatility of populist politics. It can swing left or right depending on who captures that energy and what results they deliver. Right now, the energy is dispersed. Trump activated one version of it and won a massive mandate. But governing is harder than campaigning. And if people don't see results, if their lives don't tangibly improve, that energy will look elsewhere. And figures like Mamdani are ready and waiting to redirect it towards something much more dangerous. So we're at a crossroads. One path leads toward more Mamdanis, more revolutionary rhetoric, more policies that sound good but produce disaster, more division, more decay. The other path leads toward a restoration of common sense, toward policies that actually work even if they're not emotionally titillating, toward a recognition that America's traditional principles, while imperfect, have produced more prosperity and opportunity than any alternative system ever devised. The Supreme Court's steady string of victories for constitutional principles is a sign that the institutional foundation is there. The exodus from blue states to red states is a sign that people, when given the choice, vote with their feet for what works over what sounds nice. The discomfort of figures like Van Jones is a sign that even the left is starting to recognize they've created something they can't control. But none of this is guaranteed. The crossroads is real. The choice is real. And it's going to be made not just in elections, but in countless small decisions, where businesses choose to locate, where families choose to live, which leaders people choose to follow, which ideas people choose to embrace or reject. History teaches us that societies can make catastrophic choices. They can choose comfort over freedom, equality over opportunity, security over risk, revolution over reform. And they can wake up one day and realize they've traded away everything that made their country special in exchange for promises that were never going to be kept. It's happened before. It could happen again. But history also teaches us that course corrections are possible. America has always had this remarkable ability to veer toward the edge of disaster and then pull back at the last moment. We had a civil war and came out stronger. We had a Great Depression and built the greatest middle class the world had ever seen. We had the turmoil of the 60s and 70s and elected Reagan. We faced down the Soviet Union, reformed welfare, balanced the budget, and proved that free markets and free people could outperform central planning every single time. We can do it again. But it requires something from us. It requires that we not be passive spectators. It requires that we speak up when we see nonsense, even when we're told it's not polite to do so. It requires that we support policies and leaders who are grounded in reality, even when the alternatives are more emotionally appealing. It requires that we remember what works and teach it to the next generation, even when they don't want to hear it because they think they've discovered something new. Because here's the thing, they haven't discovered anything new. Everything Mamdani is proposing has been tried before, many times, in many places, and it's failed every single time. The only new thing is that a new generation has to learn the lesson for themselves. Our job is to make sure that lesson doesn't cost them their future. The contrast couldn't be clearer. On one side, speech is full of anger and division, promising revolution and fairness, but delivering economic collapse and exodus. On the other side, quiet legal victories, constitutional restoration, and policies that create conditions for actual prosperity rather than just talking about it. One side offers feelings. The other side offers results. Van Jones's moment of honesty on CNN was significant not because he's some great oracle, but because it revealed the fear that even true believers are starting to feel. They know where this leads. Deep down, they know. They've read the history books. They've seen what happens when populist energy gets channeled into resentment rather than productivity. And they're realizing that they may have unleashed something they can't control. But Americans have always had this instinct, this built-in circuit breaker. When things get too far off track, when the noise gets too loud and the nonsense gets too deep, there's a moment where common sense reasserts itself. People take a breath, look around, and say, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense, and then they correct course. We are a nation that believes in effort over entitlement, opportunity over guaranteed outcomes, freedom over forced equality. We believe that people should be judged by their character and their contributions, not by which victim group they belong to. We believe in free speech, even when it offends. We believe in property rights, even when that means some people have more than others. We believe in limited government, even when unlimited government promises to solve all our problems. These aren't just abstract principles. They're the foundation of everything good about America. And when we abandon them, things fall apart. When we return to them, things get better. It's really that simple. So, if you believe that common sense is making a comeback, share this video. Share it with someone who needs to hear this perspective. Leave a comment below and tell me, do you think Van Jones was being honest about his concerns, or was he just trying to control the damage and manage the narrative? Hit that like button so more people can see what's really happening in this moment, because the mainstream outlets aren't going to tell this story. And if you're new here, subscribe, because this story isn't ending tonight. It's just getting started. We're going to be tracking what happens in New York as these policies get implemented. We're going to be watching the Supreme Court as it continues to restore constitutional boundaries. We're going to be following the economic data to see which states thrive and which ones wither. We're going to be analyzing the 2026 elections to see whether America continues its course correction or gets pulled back toward the chaos. This is the most important political moment in a generation, and you have a front row seat. Stay informed, stay engaged, stay hopeful, because America has been through worse, and America has always found its way back to what works. This time will be no different.